Okay. So when discussing innovation in avant-garde movement, art historians often focus on influences from fine art and neglect other sources of inspiration. Until recently, the historiography of Cubism hasn't really taken into consideration the contribution of popular culture or applied art to the formal or technical solution elaborated by Braque and Picasso during their collaboration. This paper aims to re-evaluate the role of two decorative sources. First, Braque's training as a house painter or painter-decorator, a well-known but scarcely studied influence. Second, ordinary decorative practice, using paper and glue to make decorative and useful objects, a recent field of historical research full of potential for art history. Through this paper, I would thus like to question the traditional distinction between high and low art and the manner in which art historians usually analyze the interaction between them. To understand this interaction, we must adopt an anthropological approach. It is not merely a question of technical borrowings. Influence from decorative arts often has deep-rooted sources as a way of thinking and using skill, techniques, and material. The tradesman's and house painter's skills should, for the artist, be the most vigorous material expression of painting. This 1930 quotation from Guillaume Apollinaire demonstrates that from the start, Georges Braque's artisanal origin were a well-known source of Cubism. His grandfather was a house painter in Argenteuil. His father founded a house painting and decorating business in Le Havre, and Braque was expected to take over the business. Hence, he was apprenticed first with his father, and then with some of his father's former associates, Rupallet and Rosnet in Le Havre and Laberte in Paris. Contemporary chronicles and art historians underline the trick of the trades that Braque borrowed from his formative training in decorative painting. Three techniques are usually given as example: stenciled letters, painting that incorporate sand, and fake wood and fake marble, processes he taught Picasso and that other cubists like Gris and Lawrence imitated. Stenciling letter was a basic skill for decorative painters. Indeed, a large part of the trade consisted in painting storefront and commercial signs, on which names, goods, opening hour, menu appear. The letter could be stenciled, but were usually painted by hand. Forming letters in different styles was then a common knowledge for a house painter. They knew different kinds of alphabets, Roman, Italian, Gothic, Egyptian, Antique, and different ways of ornamenting letters with shadows, perspective, colors. They were also able to modify the size and shape of the letters in order to make them fit the sign. This kind of technical skill is clearly noticeable in some of Braque's and Picasso's painting. In Picasso's Souvenir du Havre, we can recognize the Roman capital letter, and in Le Violon, Mozart Cubélique, Braque pointedly left the choke line, cordeau or parallel guide lines, visible for the letter Cubélique. The second technique usually associated with Braque's decorative training in paint is paint that incorporates sand. In his interview with Dora Vallier, Braque directly attributed the practice of adding sand to his paint to create a granular stone-like surface to his apprenticeship with Laberte. Indeed, learning to fabricate the paints and color was the cornerstone of the trade. House painter did not use ready-mixed industrial paint such as Ripolin. Each paint was made in a camion, a fireproof pail with a handle, following a precise recipe for the required tint. Thus, they mixed pre-ground pigments sold as powder, flakes, and sticks, or in barrels, with a liquid, water, glue, turpentine, oil, or varnish, to fabricate the desired shade and texture. Imitating wood and marble is the third decorative techniques Braque learned during his apprenticeship. Fake wood and fake marbles were decorative painters' masterpiece. They showed the painter's ability to imitate nature and to deceive the eye. Many specialized tools and brushes were developed for this work. The venet or spalter, brushes made for graining and striation, the badger brush to soften the overall effect. Among the tools were steel or leather combs, which the painter ran through the fresh paint to mimic the straight or undulating line of wood grain, a technique often seen in Cubism and sometimes voluntarily misappropriated, as in Picasso's Poet, where a decorator's comb is used for the hair and moustache. This is the first and most familiar interpretation. Cubism appropriated the house painter's tricks of the trade. Decorative painters means where a benefit derived from the beauties of the artisan's work, to quote André Salmon. But this analysis was not really developed. Braque's apprenticeship and technical training have never been described in detail to support this interpretation. Therefore, another material connected to the house painting trade has received less consideration. Wallpaper. During the second half of the 19th century, the use of wallpaper spread in society, and decorative painters were involved in the business of hanging it. Nevertheless, a second level of interpretation offers a more fertile understanding of these decorative borrowings. As Clement Greenberg demonstrated, stencil letters, painting with sand, fake wood and wallpaper were essential breakthroughs in the history of the Cubist movement. They enabled Braque and Picasso to move beyond the hermetic phases of analytic cubism in 1911-1912. Emphasizing the flatness of the painting substrate, they initiate a new kind of three-dimensional representation where the depicted object projects toward the viewer without any trace of volume. The successive flat planes arranged one above the other indicates each depicted object position within the painting. I would go further than Greenberg. I would argue that this radically new method of representing space derived directly from Braque's formative training as painter-decorator. Decorative painters hardly ever made use of Albertian perspective. They didn't really treat the wall as an open window onto a space behind. Instead of seeking to break through the flat surfaces, their trompe-l'œil effect create an impression of projecting relief. Depicted objects seem to stand in front of the depicted background, like a bas-relief. Filage, for example, consisted in making strips to mimic wood or stone boards or molding. This was precisely the path taken by Braque around 1908 while studying Cézanne's work. Object seems to project in front of the picture plane rather than recede behind it. Therefore, the so-called flatness of Cubism and its inverted perspective, transposed to easel painting ways of representing reality that were common in decorative painting. Likewise, the fusion of figure and ground achieved by Braque during the Cézanne and analytic phases of Cubism correspond to the decorative painter's approach to representation, which involved superimposing and blending layers on the painted surface to the point where distinction between them disappear. Using highly diluted paint, glazes, and badger brushes, they strove to erase the transition between the successive layers. In Braque's hand, the Cubist system of facetting succeeded in unifying the different planes in the painting in a rather similar manner. Finally, synthetic Cubism, representation of space as an overlay of flat plane, matched decorative painter ways of thinking about their work. Imitating wood or marble meant mastering the layering of transparent glazes to recreate the complex and tonal and textural effect of wood and marbles. Beginning with a ground glaze in the color of the type of wood or marble they wanted to imitate, they next painted successive glazes to create wood or marble patterns, the networks of the grain and the marble's rippling veins. Each of these glazes had to be as thin as possible, and the more layered they were, the more convincing the imitation would be, because the pattern of the wood or marble would seem to have greater depth. Hence, decorative painters conceived and perceived their work in terms of flat layers, just as happened in synthetic Cubism. Arguably, the house painters' very mode of thinking influenced the Cubist invention and treatment of space from 908 to 1912. Consequently, it may not be a coincidence that Cubism prevailing color, brown, gray, green, are similar to those used for stripping and for faking wood and faking marbles. This first case study shows that during creation, boundaries between categories blur. Every creative practice can help achieve the artist's goal. Braque took advantage of his formative training to find solutions to Cubism problem. Cubism is full of decorative tricks of the trade, but this influence occurred in a deep-rooted way. Technical borrowing from the decorative painter's trade were possible because techniques are materialized thought, as anthropologist Pierre Lemonnier said. They bring into play not only tools and gesture, but also representation, unconscious scheme that print their mark on technical behavior. And it is precisely this conceptual scheme, this subconscious structure beneath techniques, that Braque imported to Cubism. Understanding the interaction between high and low, therefore, means investigating the artist's technical or visual expertise in order to apprehend fully how techniques and the way of thinking they involve may be transferred from artistic category to another. The second example I would like to analyze draws the same conclusion, but from a more unconventional research field for art historians, that of amateur decorative practice. These leisure activities, which happened inside the home, consisted in making useful or decorative objects, such as a cardboard flower pot holder or lampshade ornamented with drawing or glued on pictures, weaving an umbrella stand, turning a half a barrel into a flower pot, decorating jewel or candy boxes with silk, embossed, or gold paper. These DIY or creative hobbies, to use present-day expression, proliferating during the end of the 19th century, and would have been intimately familiar to Braque and Picasso. Living in Montmartre, a very specific neighborhood of Paris, both poor and rural, they knew this alternative creative culture intimately. It was a shared culture of making. Braque, Picasso, and their friend at that time occasionally crafted everyday objects with recycled material. Picasso crafted some of his notebooks and a doll for Van Dongen's daughter. Gris made his own slippers by cutting up old shoes. Thus, the practice of self-creating decorative objects they were surrounded by found their way into Cubism, resurfacing through the three-level reading I have previously elaborated. First, ordinary creative practice were a technical repertory for Cubism, as they encompass all Cubist processes. Stenciling letters recall drizzling paint onto an item to get a negative silhouette. Adding sand to paint can be compared to covering objects like frames with sand, which might then be painted to get a united surface and hide the recycled materials. Ripolin is often employed to coat craft creation because it is cheap, robust, and ready-made. There is no need to prepare the paint. And above all, they used found objects. Indeed, domestic crafters were masters of collage and assemblage processes. They used pine cones, shells, or seeds to decorate frames. They made pictures out of stamps or cut images from newspaper or engraving. They decorated lampshades by sticking on fabrics and plants. At a deeper level, ordinary craft appear to have played a key role in Cubism evolution. As with Braque's decorative training, they provided solutions to Cubist problems, offering, for instance, stylistic and artistic effects that contributed to the new representation of space and allowed Braque and Picasso to experiment with stylistic diversity. Indeed, some popular amateur technique consisted in creating image entirely with layers of paper. The image is obtained through the superposition of papers or fabrics. The design is the result of the cutting and changes of color and texture, creating an inverted perspective, just like in analytic cubism. The different layers give the image volume. The depicted figure projects toward the viewer. The ribbon is behind the hand. The glued plant comes out of the frame, akin to the violin in Braque's painting. Pasted material can also have a textural or coloristic function. The visual effect of the work is created by the association of different pieces of fabric or paper, by slight differences in surfaces and tint. Furthermore, ordinary craft drew Braque's and Picasso's attention to the potential of heterogeneity. Thanks to their varied material and techniques, these domestic craft objects have no stylistic unity, just as happened in synthetic cubism, where the same work may combine passage of cubist fragmentation, object, the figure, with illusionistic sign, like a guitar string, rope, stencil, letter. This stylistic heterogeneity is matched by that of material, with a mixture of chromos, lace, and ribbon, or newspaper, musical score, and wallpaper. At the deepest level, by employing these techniques, Braque and Picasso imported the conceptual thinking that lies behind the practice of ordinary crafter into the realm of high art. Picasso and Braque not only found in domestic craft an inspiring example of what can be done with non-artistic means, but their concept of creation was affected by this material and technical culture. Indeed, they transposed the enforced freedom from rules of ordinary crafters, transforming it into an avant-garde method, the ability to make art with anything and in any ways. Ordinary decorative practice thus provided moral support for the invention of collage and assemblage. To conclude, Cubist example of reusing house painters' skill and domestic crafting techniques demonstrate that high and low interaction are multi-layered. They involve not only technical borrowings, but also conceptual thinking, materialized thought. One can apprehend best with an anthropological approach. First, not to miss meanings that lies behind technical acts. Second, to take in consideration the impact of everyday life on creation, the way common experience find their way into art. Artists don't find inspiration exclusively in art and its practice. They draw answers from the common creative culture they are embedded in. Just as Michael Baxendale or David Banache revealed, visual and technical abilities moves from one human field of action to another. Oops. Therefore, when studying creative processes, one must keep in mind there are no valid distinctions between common craft practice and the practice of professionally trained artists. Invented categories such as high and low can blind the art historian by creating an artificial division between areas of creativity. Thank you.